Let's continue with the second part of content marketing strategy. So, if you remember, we were saying that content is king, but given that we're taking the perspective for the most part, or you being some sort of consultant that is going to help the company do a better job in their online uh, arena, let's say, what we're going to do is we're going to try to understand first what kind of digital assets does the company already have in place, right? Before you come in to help them, whether you're an internal or external consultant, it really doesn't matter, right? Our perspective is going to be, okay, well, let's start by basically doing a careful audit of everything that already exists. How does the website look like, right? What kind of additional assets, digital assets, are already posted or have been made available through the different platforms? Do we have white papers? This is particularly pertinent if you're talking about a business to business company, right? Have we posted articles? Do we have blogs? Uh, do we have a newsletter that you can actually sign up for, right? Do we have video content? Are we present in multiple social media platforms? And the job is not just to answer yes or no, but the job is to try to map this content to the current objectives that the company has. Meaning, how is the content that is already present helping me, the company's last brand, achieve the goals that we have set forth? Right? So this is going to be a pretty long and maybe arduous process. We are going to have to ask yourself about the different objectives and goals that you have in place, how the different pieces of content that you have already created and or shared online, how are they helping you? And a good way of probably doing this is mapping it into some sort of database. Typical type of database that you will use for this simplistically will be a spreadsheet. So that you have an example on the slide of a spreadsheet where you will have all sort of information about the content. Where is that content? What kind of media are we using or channel to deliver that content, and how does it map to the actual goals that we have set forth? And then after you actually know what you have available, what you need to do is you need to find the whole. Essentially, what are the things that are not created that will actually help us achieve those objectives and goals that we have already mentioned, right? And to do that, you need to shift your perspective online, because customers and visitors have a myriad of choices. You cannot take a hard sales approach. It's not going to help almost in any case, right? So the kind of content that you're going to have to be creating is content that people are actually excited about. So you need to take an approach that will make you more of a content publisher than a sales specialist, right? So there is kind of a big shift in the themes, in the actual content that you create, uh, between a more traditional, maybe advertising that is trying to close the sale, at least to some degree, some ads are, to creating content that is going to be tangentially relevant to the products most of the time and not directly. So here you have an example in the slide um, of a website that is basically created by L'Oreal, which obviously, among other things, have beauty products, right? And what they do is, instead of trying to tell you how great their products are, what they are doing is they're trying to create content that is pertinent, relevant, and maybe even inspirational for their target customers or their target potential customers, and provide information that is engaging and interesting, and they can obviously showcase laterally how some of the products from our product portfolio could actually help with this task, but it's really not the main aspect or the main topic behind any of these articles. You might have a section of content that is more geared towards closing the sale. But overall, that kind of content is not going to be the one that customers are going to want to engage with unless they are at the last stages of the customer journey, which they may or may not be. In fact, most of the times they are not, right? So you need to think about content as content generating value that is unique for the customer, right? And to achieve that, most of the times you're going to have to strive a good balance between brand information and subject matter information. And striking that balance is going to be challenging. You're going to have to experiment, see what works, see what doesn't, see how much of the brand specific content you can get away with versus providing value that is generic for the customer. Might actually take that value and basically run with products and services from other companies. So striking that balance between the two, it's more an art in my experience than a science. Good. So other than that, you need to think about how are you going to plan uh, this content generation, content creation, and dissemination. Okay. Now to do this, you need to realize that there's going to be multiple departments within the organization that are going to be either directly or indirectly involved in messaging customers and interacting with customers. And because of that, keeping that messaging tight, coordinated, and with the same themes and topics is a big challenge. Like the coordination effort required, because it's not only folks in the marketing department, you are also going to have probably sales involved. You're going to have customer service folks involved. If you have a PR department, they also have to have similar themes and topics to make sure everything is coordinated. And if your website is mostly supported by IT, also IT needs to be closed in the loop so that the content that is actually displayed there, it's actually consistent with the brand essence that you're trying to communicate. So this whole coordination of the content to make sure that the themes and the topics are consistent across the different interactions with the customer base is very, very essential. Now, to achieve this, sometimes, especially if you're in a large organization, it might be useful to create structures within the organization that enable you to do this per se. Instead of hoping that you're going to be able to juggle all these balls, it might be necessary to appoint some sort of either point person or department that is in charge of coordinating the messaging to make sure that there is essentially one voice that is speaking in all these different angles and ways when it comes down to interacting with the customer. And not only you need to coordinate, but you're going to have to start planning how that content is going to be created, but be also disseminated and distributed. Now to do this, you need to acknowledge the fact that if you compare with more traditional marketing, when you have these big campaigns like ad campaigns, where between ad campaigns there is pretty much not a lot going on in terms of messaging. That is not the case online. In online, we have, for the most part, if you want to be successful, a model that approaches more those big bang campaigns, but in between those campaigns, you still have a trickle down on information that still needs to be there, right? So let's say, for example, that you have a blog, right? So maybe posting the blog happens weekly, right? So those will be like the big campaigns, right, within that particular channel. But in between those blog postings that might happen daily, weekly, or monthly, it really depends on your capabilities internally to generate all this content. And keeping this up in the long term, it requires obviously people and resources, right? But let's say it's weekly. What you're going to have to do within the week, even though you're still generating your content and you don't have anything to post for 6 days, you still might have to interact with customers. So for example, a lot of blogs sites will actually have a comment section under the blog, right? So you want to have either the author of the post or some other person in charge of interaction with customers online answering to some of those comments, so that you can keep a decent level of engagement with your customers. So you go from just having these big bangs and nothing in between, which is the traditional or advertising model, to just have those big campaigns, like if you're posting a new video a month, right? But then in between, you still need to keep up the interaction with your customers. So you move to having maybe different sources of interaction, some of which are more continuous and some of which are going to be maybe a little bit more punctuated over time. Okay. Now, when it comes down to this, also acknowledge that you're going to have to be creating this content over time. So you're actually going to need dedicated people, obviously, because if you're going to maintain a reasonable stream of content coming out, you're going to have somebody that is dedicated to this. Also mention that usually customers are going to expect a certain cadence to this content, right? And setting up those expectations up front and sticking to them is very important, right? So people are okay with you posting every 2 weeks instead of every week a blog post, but they want to know what to expect. So if you make those expectations very clear and you tell everybody that this is going to be a bi-weekly blog, customers are usually okay with that. They are understanding so long as their expectations are set up front, and most importantly, they are met, right? So don't overcommit, okay? And then now, regardless of how good your content is, if your target market is not getting that content, if you're not reaching the right users / customers, obviously it's a waste, right? So for you to be doing a good job in your content management, you also need to work on the distribution aspect, right? And for doing that, you need to find some sort of way of matching your content to the kind of media or channel that you're using to disseminate that content. Okay. Now, to do this, a few things that you should be well aware of is, for example, a lot of social media platforms, what they are going to do is, instead of showing all the content to users, they are going to use essentially some sort of algorithm, in particular some sort of predictive algorithm, that is going to basically try to only show to the user content that the algorithm thinks the user is going to be interested in, right? And to do this, you build some sort of predictive model, and that is way beyond the scope of this class. But the idea is simple. I know your past history as a user, right? So because of that, I can make good guesses about what kind of content you're going to click in, and not only click, but spend time, and not only spend time, but maybe go beyond that and click further, maybe downstream from that content into a website and or buy a product, etc., etc. And this process of selecting what content you put in front of the user, we call it algorithmic curation, right? What you're doing is basically you're curating content in a way that you're trying to maximize the chances that the user will actually click on it. Now, if you think about it like this from a simplistic perspective, let's pick maybe a smaller problem that everybody can relate to instead of talking about a social media platform like Facebook. What about how does Netflix interact with customers, right? Once that you log in into your page, right, or app, if you're using it on a phone, what Netflix is going to do is, instead of showing you a portfolio of all the movies that Netflix has available for you, what it does is, let's say that they have a portfolio of 10,000 movies, and I really don't know what the figures are, right? They are going to put in front of you a few movies that they think have a good chance of being picked by you, and not only picked, but after watching it, liked, okay? But obviously picking the movie is the first step, right? And to do this, what Netflix is going to do is it's going to essentially use your past history. This is why in the beginning, one thing that Netflix might do is it might ask you for your opinions, for you to rate some movies. So it might show you some movies and say, you know, have you seen this movie? Yes, no, and if you've seen it, how will you rate it, right? They are trying to basically get at what you've done in the past if you're a new user. And if you're not a new user, they're going to use all your past history on what movies you've seen, and also for how long you've seen them, or if you've seen it multiple times. And they are going to try to see some sort of algorithm that is going to basically propose to you a few movies that have similar characteristics than the ones that you have A, watched in the past, and B, probably enjoy as well. Obviously, you will weight those more heavily, right? That is the idea behind algorithmic curation. You're basically trying to predict what the customer wants to see. And in the case of, for example, social media, right, what you're going to do is the post in Facebook, for example, that you're going to see, they're going to, in some cases, come from people in your friends group, but you're going to have intertwined between those other postings that Facebook thinks are going to be interesting to you. Right? Now, what that means is if you create some content in any of these platforms, like YouTube, for example, you need to come up with ways of making sure that you have a good chance that your content will actually be shown to your potential customers, right? And there might be some ways of forcing the issue, like in YouTube, for example. You can ask, although you don't get to do it, ask your subscribers to click on the bell, and the bell will notify all the people that are A, your subscribers, and B, they have chosen the bell option whenever you post a new video, right? In that case, it's not basically based on the algorithm, it's just one of the features. But essentially what you want to do is you want to maximize the chances that you will show up among those options that are shown to your potential customers. And to do that, you're going to have to leverage the same principles that we have discussed in SEO in general, okay? And apply those to the content so that you maximize the chances that people will see it. Now, you need to realize SEO and content marketing, they tend to go in opposite directions, especially content-wise. What do I mean by that? SEO is usually interested in having very specific and narrow options. In this case, it tends to be things like keywords, but essentially, if you're building your content around keywords, it will be content, but it's narrow and specific. On the other hand, content marketing tends to be more interested in more broad topics. So there is kind of a balance that you need to strike between these two, and it's actually a challenging thing to do a good job so that you can A, keep it interesting to your customers, but at the same time have a good chance that they will actually see it. Now, on top of this curation, you need to also realize that not all channels are created equal. Right? There is going to be a fit that is associated with the channel, right? So obviously the type of content that you're going to create is going to dictate this, right? So videos are better displayed in some channels than others, although this is expanding and changing over time. So if you go back 10 years, YouTube was the obvious place for you to engage with customers if you were going to use video. But right now, for example, Twitter is making a big push for videos in their platform. And we'll see how that evolves over time, but there is going to be multiple players that are going to enable you to engage with customers. So you're going to be looking at their capabilities in terms of the kind of media that are going to be able to display and provide to customers. But beyond that, you also want to understand what the demographic and other targeting issues are. So the kind of people that are going to use different media are going to be different, right? So you will take a very similar approach to this that you will take to an advertising media selection, right? So you will try to basically find the media and the channels that are going to be best suited to reach the customers that you're interested in with the type of media that they are interested in watching. So it's going to be a difficult needle maybe to thread, but the nice thing is there are many options. The downside is that you're going to have to consider all of them and see which one is going to do a better job at this. Okay. Now let me walk you through a few tools that you can use to do at least some of the tasks associated with the things that we have discussed. Okay. The first thing is you should have clear guidelines that basically keep some sort of standardization or coordination when it comes down to all these messaging elements across multiple platforms. How do you do that? Well, thematically, you need to be very clear about the brand essence and brand personality that we have discussed and what kind of brand associations you're trying to further down, given the values that you are trying to basically espouse as a brand. And those should be well known by everybody that is doing any messaging, and the messaging should reflect that brand essence. Okay, so this is a thematic coordination effort, which is very important, right? If you're telling customers very different things, regardless of whether it's different media or not, you're going to confuse them and they're going to ignore it. If you send multiple messages, they contradict each other, people just tune into somebody else because they don't have really the time to tease out which one of the two you really mean. Number one. Number two, there are many aspects of the brand that matter. Logos, obviously, you want to keep those consistent across, but also things like colors and fonts give a very different experience to the customer. So it's not just what you say, but it's how it's perceived, and little details like keeping consistent font across multiple channels and similar color palettes are particularly important. So you should have some sort of policy established in place to make sure that this coordination keeps everybody using similar digital assets, at least as much as possible. And the same thing is not only what you say and how it's displayed visually or audio-wise, but also the tone you use, right? You can be very playful, you can be very serious, and if the tone changes dramatically across media, people are going to start wondering whether it's the same brand, right? So while there is variation that is possible, and if everything is the same, it might get a little boring, right? Striking the balance between having completely different ways of communicating across very different media might actually get you in situations where that consistency is lost. Okay. Now, these three elements that I've discussed is what typically is known as a brand style guideline or guides. Okay, and most firms have some of these, especially if they are mid or large size. Okay, what else? Another thing that you're gonna need if you want to take content seriously is some sort of content calendar. And what this is going to do is it's going to enable you to essentially track what is going to be developed by who and where in terms of content, right? So if you have a blog, you have 2 or 3 other social media platforms, you have a website, right? The different pieces of content that are going to be created for those different channels need to be planned, and basically you need to determine what is the best time for those to actually be aired. So the kind of questions that you should actually ask yourself when you're thinking about creating your content calendar are the obvious questions. What content is going to be developed? Okay. When is that content going to be posted / aired? Okay. And 3, where, which one of the channels is going to be the one that is going to try to distribute that channel? Finally, internally, although maybe externally this is not obvious, you need to decide who is going to be developing that content, obviously. Okay, good. Finally, another 2 tools that you might consider using. One would be a workflow map that's going to enable you to plan who's going to be working on what parts of the content development, planning, and distribution aspect, right? Especially when you're talking about a large brand that has many different content pieces scheduled, and there are different people that are going to be in charge of different parts. You might have some writers that write some of the content. You might have people that actually perform the content, like you might have a designated person that actually is in charge of creating the video. There may be a separate person editing those videos, right? So when you have a complex team like that, it's actually useful to have a workflow map where you can see who's going to be doing what and where, right? This is going to enable you to plan better, make sure that you have the right resources in place, and they are going to be successfully able to create make sure that the content is quality and that it actually is having the reach and objectives that you're interested in obtaining. And then finally, like we were alluding to before, there is this idea of persona research that is particularly useful. So if you are creating all this content for specific personas, it's very useful to keep, let's just say, a very good description of who those personas are, what kind of motivations are behind their purchases, what kind of activities will they engage in, what kind of personality traits will they have, where are we going to be encountering this particular group of people, or in this case, this imaginary character that kind of captures a whole segment of the population. And keeping a very granular and good description of the personas is going to be tremendously helpful whenever you're trying to think about the kind of content that will be useful for this unknown person. That's what I have for today.